Logic is pure science, that is, pure knowledge in the entire range of its development. 95. All that is needed to rid oneself of all other reflections and opinions whatever, simply to take up what is there before us. Starting from the determination of pure knowledge, the only requirement for ensuring the beginning remains inherent in its scientific development is to simply observe what is already present, without any external influences or biases. 96. Pure knowing is only simple immediacy. Pure knowing, when concentrated into a unified state, eliminates any reference to external factors or mediation. It becomes devoid of distinctions and, as a result, ceases to be knowledge in the traditional sense. What remains is merely simple immediacy. 97. Simple immediacy is itself an expression of reflection and contains a reference to its distinction from what is mediated. Simple immediacy, while seemingly basic, is a product of reflection and implies a distinction from what is mediated. In its true expression, simple immediacy is pure being. Just as pure knowing represents knowing in its most abstract form, pure being signifies being in general, without any further specification or detail. 98. If no presupposition is to be made, all that is present is that we propose to consider thought as such. Being's beginning, being is presented as originating through mediation, a process that both establishes and negates itself. Presupposition of pure knowing. The starting point assumes pure knowing as the result of finite knowing and consciousness. Immediate beginning. If no presuppositions are made, the beginning is simply the starting point of logic or thought itself. Resolve to consider thought. The core idea is a decision, potentially seen as arbitrary, to examine thought in its essence. 99. The beginning therefore is pure being. Absolute beginning. The starting point must be an absolute or abstract beginning, independent and unmediated. Ground of science. This beginning serves as the foundation of the entire scientific system, not relying on any external factors. Pure immediacy. The beginning is characterized by pure immediacy, devoid of any relationships or mediating factors. No determination. The beginning lacks any determination or content, as these would imply distinctions and relationships. Pure being. Ultimately, the beginning is defined as pure being, the most fundamental and undifferentiated concept. Underlined by Lenin. The beginning therefore is pure being. 100. Preliminary prejudices must be disposed of within the science itself, where their treatment should be awaited with patience. The simple exposition of the logical beginning is self-sufficient and complete. Further reflections based on preconceived ideas are discouraged. Preconceptions and biases should be addressed within the science itself. Patience is required for the proper resolution of these issues within the scientific framework. 101. Absolute truth must be a result, and conversely, a result presupposes a prior truth. Absolute truth as a result. The insight recognizes that absolute truth is a result, implying the existence of a prior truth. Hypothetical and problematical beginning. This leads to the idea that philosophy must start with a provisional truth and that philosophizing is initially a quest for the ultimate truth. Reinhold's emphasis. Reinhold, in his later work, stressed this view due to its relevance to the speculative nature of philosophical beginnings. Progress as retrogression. The discussion reveals a unique perspective on progress in logic, suggesting it is a backward movement that grounds and establishes the initial assumption as the actual primary truth. 102. The advance is a retreat into the ground to what is primary and true. Advance as retreat. The passage highlights the idea that progress in logic is actually a retreat into the foundational ground, the primary truth that underlies and originates the starting point. Consciousness and absolute knowledge. It draws a parallel with consciousness, which, in its progression from initial immediacy, returns to absolute knowledge as its innermost truth. This absolute knowledge, the ground, becomes the source from which the initial immediacy proceeds. Absolute spirit's self-externalization. The concept of absolute spirit is introduced, which reveals itself as the ultimate truth of all being. It unfolds itself into the creation of the world, encompassing everything that came before. Circular nature of logic. The The passage emphasizes that the essential requirement for the science of logic is not that the beginning be pure immediacy, but rather that the entire science forms a circle where the first and last points are interconnected. 103. It is equally necessary to consider as result that into which the movement returns as into its ground. Movement is cyclical. It both starts from and returns to its ground. The beginning ground is both starting point and result. Progress is a further determination of the beginning, not a transition into something entirely other. The beginning remains present and preserved throughout the development. The beginning of philosophy is the foundation for all subsequent development. 104. Hence the line of the scientific advance becomes a circle. Progress makes the beginning less one-sided and abstract. Scientific advancement is cyclical, returning to the beginning with enriched understanding. The undeveloped beginning is not fully known until the end of the logical process. The entirety of logic is needed to fully know and ground the beginning. 105. This progress in knowing must be determined by the nature of the subject matter itself and its content. While the result is the absolute ground, the process of knowing is not temporary or uncertain. The progression in knowledge is determined by the inherent nature and content of the subject matter itself. Lenin. The advancement of knowledge, or Kenans, is not arbitrary but determined by the inherent nature and content of the subject matter itself. The beginning contains both nix, nothingness, and sane, being, existing in unity. The beginning is not yet fully being, but is in the process of becoming being. There is a transition from not being to being, with not being also containing being within it. Lenin. Focus on reading Hegel materialistically. Interpret Hegel as materialism which has been stood on its head. Engels. Disregard concepts like God, the absolute, the pure idea, etc. 106. The beginning is neither arbitrary nor a provisional assumption, but is subsequently shown to have been properly made. The beginning of a philosophical inquiry is not an arbitrary assumption, a tentative presupposition later justified, similar to geometric constructions where initial steps are justified later. Unlike geometric proofs, the starting point of a philosophical investigation is intrinsic to the inquiry itself. 107. If it were determinate, it would have been taken as something mediated. Pure being is the starting point of the science of logic because it is the most fundamental concept and requires no prior knowledge or assumptions. Pure being is the unity into which pure knowing withdraws, making it both immediate and mediated. At the beginning, pure being is considered only in its immediate aspect, as pure indeterminateness. A beginning must be pure being and nothing else, as determinateness implies something already mediated. Entering philosophy requires no preparations beyond the concept of pure being. 108. Here at the start, where the subject matter itself is not yet to hand, philosophy is an empty word. The beginning of philosophy lacks any concrete content or determination, as philosophy itself is still undefined at this stage. Pure knowing only indicates that the beginning should be abstract, without further specifying it. If pure being is the content of pure knowing, the latter must remain passive, allowing the content to unfold independently. If pure being is the unity into which knowing collapses, knowing itself disappears, leaving no distinction from the unity and thus no means to determine it further. No other content exists to make the beginning more determinate. 109. The determination of being so far adopted for the beginning could also be omitted, so that the only demand would be that a pure beginning be made. 110. The beginning therefore contains both being and nothing, is the unity of being and nothing. 111. In the beginning, being and nothing are present as distinguished from each other. 112. Let those dissatisfied with being as a beginning begin with the general idea of a beginning. 113. This takes it for granted that everyone has roughly the same general idea of it. 114. The beginning cannot be made with anything concrete, anything containing a relation within itself. 115. What the subject matter is that will be explicated in the development of the science cannot be presupposed. 116. Let those who are still dissatisfied with this beginning avoid these defects by beginning in some other way. 117. Some begin with the ego because the first truth must be something with which we are acquainted. 118. But the ego is the most concrete of all things. 119. The ego which formed the starting point is still entangled in the world of appearance. 120. In logic we are concerned the determinate reality in thought of what is inner. 121. This simple determination which has no other meaning, this emptiness, is therefore the beginning of philosophy. 122. These preliminary were not so much intended to lead up to it as rather to eliminate all preliminaries. General division of being. 123. Being is first, as against another in general. Second, immanently self-determining. Third, abstract indeterminateness. 124. Being is distinct from essence, for later in its development it proves to be in its totality only one sphere of the notion. 125. Being will posit itself in three determinations: quality, quantity, and measure. 126. With Kant these are supposed to be only titles for his categories, though they are, in fact, themselves categories. 127. Hitherto the determination of quantity has been made to precede quality, but the beginning is made with being as such. 128. Measure is a relation, the specific relation between quality and quantity. 129. Relation falls within the section quality. Section 1. Determinateness. Quality. 130. Being is the indeterminate immediate. 131. The first being is in itself determinate, and therefore, secondly, determinate being, thirdly, being for self. Chapter 1 Being a Being. 132. Pure being has no diversity within itself nor any with a reference outwards. Be nothing. 133. Nothing is the same determination, or rather absence of determination, and thus altogether the same as pure being. See Becoming 1. Unity of being and nothing. 134. But it is equally true that they are not undistinguished from each other, that, on the contrary, they are not the same. Remark 1. The opposition of being and nothing in ordinary thinking. 135. Nothing is usually opposed to something, but is already thereby distinguished from a determinate something. 136. Heraclitus brought forward the concept of becoming and said, being as little is, as nothing is, or all flows, all is a becoming. 137. Those who maintain that nothing is just nothing are unaware that they subscribe to the pantheism of the Eleatics and Spinoza. 138. Nowhere in heaven or on earth is there anything which does not contain within itself both being and nothing. 139. What is in question is not such concrete something but only the pure abstractions of being and nothing. 140. It is not a matter of indifference to it whether a certain other content with which it is in relation is or is not. 141. Kant said that being is not a determination of the content of a thing. 142. Ordinary thinking transforms the abstract being and nothing which should be apprehended into a definite being and nothing. 143. The concept of a determinate existence, says Kant, gains nothing by its being perceived. 144. What is the first in the science had of necessity to show itself historically as the first? 145. The reference back from particular finite being to being in its abstract universality is the first theoretical demand and the first practical demand too. 146. The abstract definition of God, on the other hand, is precisely that his notion and his being are unseparated and inseparable. Remark 2. Defectiveness of the expression unity. Identity of being and nothing. 147. The proposition, being is the same as nothing, enunciates both determinations, being and nothing, and contains them as distinguished. 148. The proposition contains the result, but the result is not itself expressed in the proposition. 149. The deficiency is made good in the first place by adding the contrary proposition. Being and nothing are not the same. 150. The result which we have here before us is becoming, which is not merely the one-sided or abstract unity of being and nothing. 151. The third in which being and nothing subsist must also present itself here, and it has done so. It is becoming. 152. The challenge to distinguish between being and nothing also includes the challenge to say what, then, is being and what is nothing. Remark 3. The isolating of these abstractions. 153. Transition is the same as becoming. 154. We shall consider some of the results which appear when being and nothing are postulated in isolation. 155. With Parmenides as with Spinoza, there is no progress from being ot absolute substance to the negative to the finite. 156. Jacobi recognized very clearly the insubstantial nature, the non-ends of abstraction. 157. This abstract purity of continuity is the same as what the Indian calls Brahma, sitting for years on end looking at the tip of his nose. 158. In this void, Jacobi says, he experiences the opposite of what Kant assures him he should experience. 159. Is this still a synthesis if Jacobi omits precisely that which makes the unity a synthetic unity? 160. Consciousness can make empty space, empty time its object, but it does not stop at that. It goes beyond it. 161. It is the thought of such indeterminates that is to be demonstrated as null. 162. Because being is devoid of all determination whatsoever, it is not being but nothing. 163. Being is posited only as immediate, therefore nothing emerges in it. But all the subsequent determinations are more concrete. 164. That nothing is the result and should make the beginning, as in Chinese philosophy, need not cause us to lift a finger. 165. The dialectic employed by Plato in treating of the one in the Parmenides is also a dialectic of external reflection. 166. Being, taken as it is immediately, belongs to a subject, is something enunciated. 167. Nothing, taken in its immediacy, shows itself as affirmative, as being. 168. Just as little is seen in pure light as in pure darkness. 169. The transition of being and nothing into each other is to be understood as it is without any further elaboration of the transition by reflection. Remark 4. Incomprehensibility of the beginning. 170. Let us consider the Kantian antinomy which proves that a beginning of the world, or of anything, is impossible. 171. If the world or anything is supposed to have begun, then it must have begun in nothing. 172. In this proof nothing is brought forward against becoming, or beginning and ceasing, against this unity of being and nothing. 173. With the absolute separateness of being from nothing presupposed, then of course beginning or becoming is something incomprehensible. 174. There is nothing which is not an intermediate state between being and nothing. 175. We call dialectic the higher movement of reason in which such seemingly utterly separate terms pass over into each other spontaneously. 2. Moments of becoming, coming to be and ceasing to be. 176. Becoming is the unseparatedness of being and nothing, not the unity which abstracts from being and nothing. 177. Becoming therefore contains being and nothing as two such unities, each of which is itself a unity of being and nothing. 178. Becoming is in this way in a double determination. 179. They are not reciprocally sublated, but each sublates itself in itself. 3. Sublation of becoming. 180. Becoming is an unstable unrest which settles into a stable result. 181. Becoming is the vanishing of being and nothing, but at the same time it rests on the distinction between them. 182. This stable oneness is being, yet no longer as a determination on its own but as a determination of the whole. 183. Becoming, as this transition into the unity of being and nothing, is determinate being. Remark. The expression to sublate. 184. To sublate constitutes one of the most important notions in philosophy which repeatedly occurs throughout the whole of philosophy. 185. To sublate has a twofold meaning in the language. On the one hand it means to preserve, to maintain, and equally it also means to cause to cease, to put an end to. 186. It is remarkable to find that a language has come to use one and the same word for two opposite meanings. 187. Being and nothing are the same, but just because they are the same they are no longer being and nothing, but now have a different significance. Chapter 2 Determinate being. 188. Through its quality, something is determined as opposed to an other, as alterable and finite. 189. Determinate being falls into three parts. Determinate being as such, finitude, qualitative infinity. A determinate being as such. 190. Determinate being as such is first of all quality, as reality and negation. A determinate being in general. 191. From becoming there issues determinate being, which is the simple oneness of being and nothing. 192. It is not mere being but determinate being, their being. 193. Only that which is posited in a notion belongs in the dialectical development of that notion to its content. 194. Determinate being is concrete. B. Quality. 195. Determinateness has not yet severed itself from being. 196. Determinateness thus isolated by itself in the form of being is quality. 197. Quality taken in the distinct character of being is reality. 198. Negation taken as mere deficiency would be equivalent to nothing, but it is a determinate being. Remark: quality and negation. 199. Reality may seem to be a word of various meanings because it is used of different, indeed of opposed determinations. 200. God was defined as the sum total of all realities, and of this sum total it was said that no contradiction was contained in it. 201. Reality as thus conceived is assumed to survive when all negation has been thought away. 202. If reality is taken in its determinateness, then the sum total of all realities becomes a sum total of all negations, all contradictions. 203. Negation is as little an ultimate for philosophy as reality is for it truth. 204. Spinoza grasped thought and being as attributes, as not having a separate existence, a self-subsistent being of their own. 205. Negation stands directly opposed to reality. 206. Quality is especially a property only where, in an external relation, it manifests itself as an immanent determination. 207. Jacob Boehm's Qualierung, or Inqualierung, signify quality's own internal unrest by which it produces and maintains itself only in conflict. See something. 208. In determinate being its determinateness has been distinguished as quality, but there is distinction of reality and negation. 209. This sublatedness of the distinction is determinate being's own determinateness, a something. 210. Determinate being, life, thought, etc., determine themselves to become a determinate being, a living creature, a thinker, ego. 211. Something is the negation of the negation in the form of being. 212. Something as a becoming is a transition, the moments of which are themselves somethings. Be finitude. 213. In this section, the negative determination contained in determinate being is developed. A something and other. 214. 1. Something and other are, in the first place, both determinate beings or somethings. 215. Otherness thus appears as a determination alien to the determinate being. 216. Both are determined equally as something and as other, and are thus the same. 217. The other is to be taken as isolated, as in relation to itself abstractly as the other. 218. The otherness, which is at the same time a moment of it, is distinct from it and does not appertain to the something itself. 219. 2. Something preserves itself in the negative of its determinate being. 220. Determinate being as such is immediate without relation to an other. 221. Being for other and being in itself are, therefore, posited as moments of one and the same something. 222. Non-being is, in this unity of being and non-being, not negative determinate being in general but an other. 223. Being in itself has also present in it non-being itself, for it is itself the non-being of being for other. 224. Being for other is negative determinate being which points to being in itself as to its own being. 225. 3. Both moments are determinations of what is one and the same, namely, the something. 226. People fancy that they are saying something lofty with the in itself, but what something is only in itself is an abstract determination. 227. Things are called in themselves insofar as abstraction is made from all being for other. 228. In being, the meaning of each opposite is complete even without its other. In essence, the opposites are meaningless without one another. 229. Determinateness reflected into itself is, therefore, again in the simple form of being a quality. B. Determination, constitution and limit. 230. The in itself into which something is reflected into itself out of its being for other is no longer an abstract in itself. 231. 1. The quality of the essential unity of the in itself in the simple something with its other moment is the determination of the in itself. 232. The determination of man is thinking reason. By it he is distinguished from the brute. 233. 2. The filling of the in itself with determinateness is distinct from the determinateness which is only being for other. 234. It is the quality of something to be open to external influences and to have a constitution. 235. Insofar as something alters, the alteration falls within its constitution. 236. Determination and constitution are thus distinguished from each other. 237. The first was only an implicit alteration belonging to the inner notion. Now alteration is also posited in the something. 238. The transition of determination and constitution into each other is sublation of their difference, resulting in the positing of something in general. 239. There is a single determinateness of both. This determinateness is limit. 243. Being for other is the indeterminate, affirmative community of something with its other. 241. Something, therefore, is immediate self-related determinate being, and has a limit in the first place, relatively to another. 242. The limit is simple negation or the first negation, whereas the other is, at the same time, the negation of the negation. 243. Something is the limit relatively to another something, but the limit is present in the something itself. 244. The negative determinate being and the determinate being of the something fall outside each other. 245. In accordance with this difference of something from its limit, the line appears as line only outside its limit, the point. 246. But further, something as it is outside the limit, the unlimited something, is only a determinate being in general. 247. Something with its immanent limit posited as the contradiction of itself, directed and forced out of and beyond itself, is the finite. C. Finitude. 248. The being of something is determinate. Something has a quality and in it is not only determined but limited. 249. When we say of things that they are finite, we understand that non-being constitutes their nature and being. 250. The thought of the finitude of things brings this sadness with it because it is qualitative negation pushed to its extreme. 251. No philosophy or opinion will let itself be tied to the standpoint that the finite is absolute. 252. This nothing is supposed to be only nothing. Limitation and the ought. 253. This contradiction is abstractly present simply in the circumstance that the something is finite, or that the finite is. 254. Determination and constitution showed themselves as sides for external reflection. 255. In order that the limit in something should be a limitation, something must at the same time in its own self transcend the limit. 256. The ought therefore contains the determination in double form. 257. The finite has thus determined itself as the relation of its determination to its limit. 258. What ought to be is, and at the same time is not. If it were, we could not say that it ought merely to be. 259. The limitation of the finite is not something external to it. On the contrary, its own determination is also its limitation. 260. The finite as the ought transcends its limitation. Its limit is also not its limit. 261. Something has a limitation insofar as it has negation in its determination. Remark. The ought. 262. The ought has recently played a great part in philosophy, especially in connection with morality. 263. You can because you ought. 264. In the ought the transcendence of finitude, that is, infinity, begins. 265. The very fact that something is determined as a limitation implies that the limitation is already transcended. 266. The sentient creature, in the limitation of hunger, thirst, etc., is the urge to overcome this limitation, and it does overcome it. 267. Leibniz said that if a magnet possessed consciousness, it would regard its pointing to the north as a determination of its will. 268. Reason and law are not in such a bad way that they only ought to be. Transition of the finite into the infinite. 269. The ought as such contains limitation, and limitation contains the ought. See infinity. 270. The infinite is a fresh definition of the absolute. As indeterminate self-relation, it is posited as being and becoming. 271. Even so, the infinite is not yet really free from limitation and finitude. 272. The infinite is a. Affirmative as negation of the finite, b. The abstract, one-sided infinite, c. The genuine infinite. A. The infinite in general. 273. The infinite is the negation of the negation, affirmation, being which has restored itself out of limitedness. 274. It is the very nature of the finite to transcend itself, to negate its negation and to become infinite. B. Alternating determination of the finite and the infinite. 275. The immediate being of the infinite resuscitates the being of its negation. 276. Finitude is limitation posited as limitation. Infinity is the nothing of the finite. 277. The infinite posited over against the finite, in a relation wherein they are as qualitatively distinct others, is the spurious infinite. 278. The finite remains as a determinate being opposed to the infinite. There are two worlds, one infinite and one finite. 279. This contradiction develops its content into more explicit forms. 280. As thus separated, they are just as much essentially connected by the very negation which separates them. 281. The infinite only emerges in the finite and the finite in the infinite. 282. In this void beyond the finite, again there arises the void in which a new limit is encountered, and so on to infinity. 283. The finite is finite only in its relation to the ought or to the infinite, and the latter is only infinite in its relation to the finite. 284. The progress is a contradiction which is not resolved but is always only enunciated as present. 285. The progress to infinity is only the perpetual repetition of one and the same tedious alternation of finite and infinite. 286. The infinity of the infinite progress remains burdened with the finite as such, is thereby limited and is itself finite. C. Affirmative infinity. 287. In this alternating of the finite and the infinite, their truth is already implicitly present. 288. The finite is only that which must be transcended, the negation of itself in its own self, which is infinity. 289. The infinite and the finite viewed as connected with each other. 290. This yields the decried unity of the finite and the infinite. 291. The unity of the infinite which each of these moments is differently determined in each of them. 292. The simple unity of the infinite and finite was falsified by the understanding. So too is the double unity. 293. The unity of the finite and infinite is not an incongruous combination alien to their own nature, but each is in its own self this unity. 294. Infinity is the negative of finitude, and hence of determinateness in general. The sublating of itself in the finite is a return from an empty flight. 295. This is in itself self-relation, affirmation, but as return to itself, through the mediation which the negation of negation is. 296. The infinite progress expresses the connection of terms which are also distinct from each other. 297. Starting from the finite, the limit is transcended. We now have its beyond, the infinite, but in this the limit arises again. 298. In the infinite, the beyond of the limit, there arises another limit which has the same fate, namely that as finite it must be negated. 299. Both finite and infinite are this movement in which each returns to itself through its negation. 300. Since both the finite and the infinite are moments of the progress, they are jointly the finite, and are equally together negated in it. 301. As the infinite, they are the finite and the infinite which are themselves in process of becoming. 302. The image of true infinity becomes the circle, the line which has reached itself closed and present, without beginning and end. 303. It is not the finite which is the real, but the infinite. Thus reality is further determined as essence, notion, idea, and so on. 304. The negation is thus determined as ideality. Ideal being is the finite as it is in the true infinite. Transition 305. Ideality can be called the quality of infinity, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition. Remark 1. The infinite progress 306. The infinite and the progress to infinity are the expression of a contradiction which is itself put forward as the final solution. 307. Infinite progress is seen when one remains fixed in the contradiction of the unity of two determinations and their opposition. 308. Infinite progress, the developed infinite of the understanding, is so constituted as to be the alternation of the two determinations. 309. The resolution is not recognition of the equal correctness and incorrectness of the two assertions, but the ideality of both. 310. Some placed the essence of philosophy in assuring the question, how does the infinite go forth from itself and become finite? 311. To understand how to put questions presupposes a certain education. If one wants a better answer than that, the question is idle. 312. Expressions of sensuous conception arouse the suspicion that they spring from the level of ordinary conception. 313. In the infinite this is expressed. It is the not finite. The unity of the finite and infinite thus seems to be directly excluded. 314. The infinite no more is than pure being is. 315. The unity of the finite and infinite and the distinction between them are just as inseparable as are finitude and infinity. Remark 2. Idealism 316. The proposition that the finite is ideal constitutes idealism. 317. By the ideal is meant the form of figurate conception and imagination, and what is simply in my conception. Chapter 3 Being for Self 318. Determinate being is the sphere of difference, of dualism, the field of finitude. 319. Being for self is first the one, secondly repulsion and attraction, thirdly, the alternation of repulsion and attraction. A being for self as such 320. We have arrived at the general notion of being for self. All that is now necessary to justify our use of the term. A. Determinate being and being for self 321. Being for self is infinity which has collapsed into simple being. B. Being for one 322. This moment expresses the manner in which the finite is present in its unity with the infinite, or is an ideal being. Remark. The German expression, what for a thing, meaning what kind of a thing, 323, was für ein Ding, in other words that which is and that for which it is are one and the same. 324. To call thought, spirit, God only an ideal being presupposes the standpoint from which finite being counts as the real. 325. Eleatic being or Spinoza's substance is the abstract negation of all determinateness. The idealism of Malebranche is more explicit. 326. The Leibnizian idealism lies more within the bounds of the abstract notion. 327. The idealisms of Kant and Fichte do not go beyond the ought and remain in the dualism of determinate being and being for self. C. The 328. Being for self is the simple unity of itself and its moment, being for one. 329. 1. Negation in general 2. Two negations 3. Two that are the same 4. Sheer opposites 5. Identity as such 6. Relation which is negative and yet to its own self. Be the one and the many 330. The one is the simple self-relation of being for self in which its moments have collapsed. 331. The one is a process of determining, and as self-relation it is an infinite self-determining. A. The one in its own self 332. In its own self the one simply is. The one is not capable of becoming another. It is unalterable. 333. It is indeterminate but not, however, like being. Its indeterminateness is the determinateness which is a relation to its own self. 334. In this simple immediacy the mediation of determinate being, and all difference and manifoldness has vanished. b. The one and the void. 335. The one is the void as the abstract relation of the negation to itself. 336. Being for self determined in this manner as the one and the void has again acquired a determinate being. Remark. Atomism. 337. The one in this form appeared as the atomistic principle, according to which the essence of things is the atom and the void. 338. The void is the ground of movement only as the negative relation of the one to its negative. 339. Physics with its molecules and particles suffers from this principle of extreme externality, just as does that theory of the state which starts from the particular will of individuals. See Many Ones, Repulsion. 340. The one and the void constitute the first stage of the determinate being of being for self. 341. The one is a becoming of many ones. 342. But this is not really a becoming, for becoming is a transition of being into nothing. The one, on the other hand, becomes only one. 343. This repulsion is the positing of many ones but through the one itself. The second is the mutual repelling of ones presupposed as already present. 344. The one repels only itself from itself, therefore does not become but already is. 345. The ones are presupposed relatively to one another, supposed or posited by the repulsion of the one from itself. 346. Plurality appears not as an otherness, but as a determination completely external to the one. 347. The plurality of ones is infinity as a contradiction which unconstrainedly produces itself. Remark. The monad of Leibniz. 348. The Leibnizian idealism takes up the plurality immediately as something given and does not grasp it as a repulsion of the monads. See Repulsion and Attraction A. Exclusion of the one. 349. The many ones have affirmative being external to them, the abstract void. But they are infinity posited in the immediacy of being. Remark. The unity of the one and the many. 350. The plurality is, in the first place, non-posited otherness. The limit is only the void, only that in which the ones are not. 351. This mutual repulsion is the posited determinate being of the many ones. 352. The being for self of the many ones shows itself as their self-preservation through the mediation of their mutual repulsion. 353. The ones not only are, but they maintain themselves through their reciprocal exclusion. 354. This reflection that the ones show themselves to be one and the same and indistinguishable is a comparison made by us. 355. The negative relationship of the ones to one another is only a going together with self. 356. Self-subsistence pushed to the point of the one as a being for self is abstract, formal, and destroys itself. 357. It is an ancient proposition that the one is many and especially that the many are one. b. The one of attraction. 358. Repulsion is the self-differentiating of the one. 359. Attraction belongs equally to each of the many ones as immediately present. None has any precedence over another. 360. There is thus in the one the unity of repulsion and attraction in general. c. The relation of repulsion and attraction. 361. The difference of the one and the many is now determined as repulsion and attraction. 362. Repulsion is indifferent to attraction which is externally added to it as presupposed. Attraction is not presupposed by repulsion. 363. Repulsion is, although negative, still essentially relation. 364. Not merely is repulsion presupposed by attraction, but equally, too, there is a reverse relation of repulsion to attraction. 365. Each being a self-mediation, evident after closer consideration of them and brings them back to the unity of their notion. 366. That each presupposes itself is already implied in the relationship between repulsion and attraction, initially relative. 367. Relative repulsion is the mutual repelling of the present many ones which are supposed to be immediately given. 368. Attraction is the positing of the real one, in contrast to which the many in their determinate being are only ideal and vanishing. 369. This self-presupposing of the two determinations each for itself means that each contains the other as a moment within it. 370. This being in the determination it has now acquired is quantity. 371. The fundamental determination of quality is being and immediacy, in which determinateness is so identical with the being of something that with its alteration the something itself vanishes. 372. This unity is being only as immediacy, determinate being, being for self. Remark, the Kantian construction of matter from the forces of attraction and repulsion. 373. Attraction and repulsion, as we know, are usually retarded as forces. 374. Kant constructed matter from the forces of attraction and repulsion, or set up the metaphysical elements of this construction. 375. Matter as it exists for sense perception is no more a subject for logic than space. But attraction and repulsion are also based on the determinations here considered. 376. Later philosophers of nature gave the name construction to the most baseless concoction of unbridled imagination. 377. Kant's method is analytical, not constructive. He presupposes the idea of matter, then asks what forces are required to maintain it. 378. Kant remarks that the force of attraction just as much belongs to the concept of matter, although it is not contained in it. 379. Kant from the start one-sidedly attributes to the concept of matter only the determination of impenetrability. 380. Kant is chiefly concerned to banish the vulgar mechanistic way of thinking which stops short at impenetrability. 381. These forces are only moments which pass over into each other. 382. He defines attraction as a penetrative force by which one bit of matter acts directly on the parts of another even beyond the contact. 383. It therefore follows, quite tautologically, that where repulsion is assumed to be not, there no repulsion can take place. 384. Kant assumes further that, through the force of attraction, matter only occupies space but does not fill it. 385. Forces through which bodies act on one another and are set in motion are something quite different from forces supposed as moments of matter. 386. The same opposition of attractive and repulsive forces is made by their more developed form of centripetal and centrifugal forces. Section 2. Magnitude. Quantity. 387. Quantity is the determinateness which has become indifferent to being, a limit which is just as much no limit. 388. The indifference of the limit and of the something to the limit constitutes quantitative determinateness. 389. Firstly, pure quantity is a compact, infinite unity which continues itself into itself. 390. Secondly, this develops a determinateness which only an external one, quantum. 391. Thirdly, quantum in a qualitative form is quantitative ratio. 392. The ratio is only a formal unity of quality and quantity. Its dialectic is its transition into their absolute unity, into measure. Remark. Something's limit. 393. In something, its limit as quality is essentially its determinateness. 394. A magnitude is usually defined as that which can be increased or diminished. Magnitude would thus be that of which the magnitude can be altered. Chapter 1. Quantity, a pure quantity. 395. Quantity is sublated being for self. 396. Continuity is, therefore, simple self-same self-relation, which is not interrupted by any limit or exclusion. 397. In continuity, magnitude immediately possesses the moment of discreteness repulsion. 398. Quantity is the unity of these moments of continuity and discreteness. Remark 1. The conception of pure quantity. 399. Pure quantity has not as yet any limit or is not as yet quantum. 400. It is this externality of continuity for the ones to which atomism clings and which ordinary thinking finds it difficult to forsake. 401. It is the notion of pure quantity as opposed to the mere image of it that Spinoza has in mind. 402. More specific examples of pure quantity are space and time also matter as such, light and so forth. For O3, time is an absolute coming out of itself, a generating of the one, and immediately the annihilation of it. Remark 2. The Kantian antinomy of the indivisibility and the infinite divisibility 404. It is the nature of quantity that gives rise to the conflict or antinomy of the infinite divisibility of space, time, etc. 405. This antinomy consists solely in the fact that discreteness must be asserted just as much as continuity. 406. The second of Kant's four cosmological antinomies deals with the antithesis constituted by the moments of quantity. 407. Kantian antinomies remain an important part of the critical philosophy. They brought about the downfall of previous metaphysics. 408. Kant wanted to give his four cosmological antinomies a show of completeness by the classification which he took from his schema of the categories. 409. Kant did not take up the antinomy in the notions themselves, but in the concrete form of cosmological determinations. 410. Kant's conception of the antinomies is that they are contradictions which reason must necessarily come up against. 411. The Kantian antinomies contain nothing more than the categorical assertion of each of two opposed moments taken in isolation from the other. 412. The relevant antinomy here concerns the so-called infinite divisibility of matter. 413. To the simple, the atom, there is here opposed the composite, which is a very inferior determination compared to the continuous. 414. Like the Kantian proofs of the rest of the antinomial propositions, this proof makes the detour of being apagogic. 415. The main point, and in face of which all that precedes is completely superfluous, is mentioned, by the way, in a parenthesis. 416. The assertion that the parts are simple is only a tautology. 417. The apagogical detour thus contains the very assertion which should result from it. 418. We see the externality, that is, contingency of composition put forward as a consequence after it had already been introduced. 419. The labored, tortuous complexity serves no other purpose than to produce the merely outward semblance of a proof. 420. The apagogical form is a groundless illusion. 421. The apagogical proof begins with a proposition, but oddly enough immediately forgets it. 422. The Kantian distinction between intuition and concept has given rise to a deal of nonsense. 423. There is also involved here a clash between the continuity of space and composition. The two are confused with each other. 424. Even the best microscopes and the keenest knives have not enabled us to come across anything simple. 425. Neither taken alone has truth. This belongs only to their unity. This is the true dialectical consideration and the true result. 426. Infinitely more ingenious and profound than this Kantian antinomy are the dialectical examples of the ancient Eleatic school. 427. The solutions propounded by Aristotle of these dialectical forms merit high praise. 428. The Kantian solution of the antinomy consists solely in the supposition that reason should not soar beyond sensuous perception and should take the world of appearance as it is. Be continuous and discrete magnitude 429. 1. Quantity contains the two moments of continuity and discreteness. 430. Quantity is a concrete unity only insofar as it is the unity of distinct.